It was very dark by the time they left. The sky had not cleared, and no moon nor even a single star glimmered through the black night. The lantern that Robin carried on a pole cast a glittering circle of light on the snow, but each of them had a candle in one coat pocket just the same. When they reached the manor, old Miss Graythorne would insist on their coming in and standing in her great stone-floored entrance hall, with all the lights turned out, each holding up a candle while they sang. The air was freezing, and their breath clouded out thick and white. Now and then a stray snowflake drifted down from the sky, and Will thought of the fat lady on the bus and her predictions. Barbara and Mary were chatting away as cozily as if they were sitting at home, but behind the clatter of footsteps of all the group rang out cold and hard on the snow-caked road. Will was happy, snug in the thought of Christmas and the pleasure of carol singing. He walked along in a contented, dreamy state, clutching the big collecting box they carried in aid of Huntercomb's small, ancient, famous, and rapidly crumbling Saxon church. Then, there ahead of them, was Dawson's farm, with a large bunch of many-berried holly nailed above the back door, and the carol-singing had begun. On through the village they sang Noel for the rector, God rest ye merry gentlemen for jolly Mr. Hutton, the enormous businessman in the new mock Tudor house at the end of the village, who always looked as though he were resting very merry indeed. Once, in Royal David City, for Mrs. Pettigrew, the widowed postmistress who dyed her hair with tea leaves and kept a small limp dog which looked like a skein of grey wool, they sang Adiste Fidelis in Latin, and Las Angus dans nos Campanias in French, even though it sounded like Spanish when I said it, for tiny Miss Bell, the retired village schoolmistress, who had taught every one of them how to read and write, add and subtract, talk and think before they went on to other schools elsewhere. And little Miss Bell said huskily, "Beautiful, beautiful," and put some coins that they knew she could not afford into their collecting box, gave each of them a hug, and Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas. They went off to the next house on the list. There were 4 or 5 more, one of them the home of the lugubrious Mrs. Horniman, who did for their mother once a week, and had been born and bred in the East End of London until a bomb had blown her house to bits 30 years before. She had always given them a silver 6pence each, and so she still did, coolly disregarding changes in currency. "Wouldn't be Christmas without 6pences," Mrs. Horniman said. "I laid a good stock before we got landed with all them decimals, or so I did, so I can go on every Christmas just the way I used to, me ducks, and I reckon my stock'll see me out until I'm deep in my grave, and you're singing to someone else at this here door. Merry Christmas!" And then it was the manor, the last stop before home. "Here we come a-wassailing among the leaves so green, here we come a-wandering so fair to be seen." They always began with the old wassail song for Mrs. Graythorne, and this year the bit about the green leaves, Will reflected, was even more inappropriate than usual. The carol bounded its way along, and for the last verse Will and James soared up into the high pealing descant that they did not always use for an ending because it took so much breath. "Good master and good mistresses, while you're sitting by the fire, pray think of us for children who are wandering in the mire." Robin tugged at the big metal bell pull, whose deep clanging always filled Will with an obscure alarm, and they spiraled up in the last verse. The great door opened, and there stood Miss Graythorne's butler, in the tailcoat he wore always on Christmas Eve night. He was not a very grand butler. His name was Bates, a tall, lean, morose man who could often be seen helping the one aged gardener in the vegetable garden near the manor's back gate, or discussing his arthritis with Miss Pettigrew at the post office. "Love and joy come to you, and to you your wassail too." The butler smiled and nodded politely at them, and held the door wide, and Will all but swallowed his last high note, for it was not Bates. It was Merriman. The carol ended, and they all relaxed, shuffling in the snow. "Enchanting," Merriman said, gravely surveying them impersonally, and Miss Graythorne's high, imperious tones came ringing past them. "Bring them in, bring them in. Don't keep them waiting on the doorstep." She sat there in the long entry hall, in the same high-backed chair that they saw every Christmas Eve. She had not been able to walk for years after an accident when she was a young woman. Her horse had fallen and rolled on her, the village said, but she flatly refused ever to be seen in a wheelchair, thin-faced and bright-eyed, her gray hair always swept up on top of her head in a kind of knot. She was a figure of total mystery in Huntercombe. "How's your mother?" Miss Graythorne demanded of Paul. "And your father?" "Very well, thank you, Miss Graythorne." "Having a good Christmas?" "Splendid, thanks. I hope you are." Paul, who was sorry for Miss Graythorne, always went to some trouble to be warmly polite. He made sure now that his eyes did not flicker round the high-roofed hall as he spoke, for although the cook, housekeeper, and the maid were standing beaming at the back of the hall, and though of course there was the butler who had opened the front door, otherwise in all this great house there was no trace of any visitor, tree, decoration, or any other sign of Christmas festivity, save for one gigantic branch of many-berried holly hanging over the mantel. "An odd season, this," Miss Graythorne said, looking at Paul pensively. "So full of a number of things, as that odious little girl in the poem said." She turned suddenly to Will. "Are you having a busy time? And you are having a busy time of it this year, eh, young man?" "I certainly am," said Will frankly, caught off balance. "A light for your candles," said Merriman, in a low, respectful tone, coming forward with a box of enormous matches. Hastily, they all tugged the candles from their pockets, and he struck a match and moved carefully among them, the light turning his eyebrows into fantastic bristling hedges, and the lines from nose to mouth into deep shadowed ravines. Will looked thoughtfully at his tailcoat, which was cut away at the waist, and which he wore with a kind of jabot at the neck instead of a white tie. He was having some difficulty in thinking of Merriman as a butler. Someone at the back of the hall turned out the lights, leaving the long room lit only by a group of flickering flames in their hands. There was the soft tap of a foot, and they began with the sweet lullaby called "Lallay, Lallay, Thou Tiny Little Child," ending it with a last wordless verse played only by Paul. The clear, husky sound of the flute fell through the air like bars of light and filled Will with a strange aching longing, a sense of something waiting far off that he could not understand. Then for contrast they sang "God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen," and then "The Holly and the Ivy," and then they were back on Good King Wenceslas. Always a grand finale for Miss Graythorne, and always making Will sorry for Paul, who had once observed that this carol was so totally unsuited to his kind of music that it must have been written by someone who despised the flute. But it was fun being the page, trying to make his voice so exactly match James's, that the two of them together sounded like one boy. "Sire, he lives a good league hence," and Will thought, "We're really doing well this time. I'd swear James wasn't singing at all if underneath the mountain, if it weren't for the fact that his mouth's moving right along the forest fence." And he glanced through the gloom as he sang, and saw, with a shock as brutal as if someone had thumped him on the stomach, that in fact James's mouth was not moving, nor was any other part of James, nor of Robin or Mary or any of the Stantons. They stood there immobile, all of them, caught out of time, as the walker had stood in Oldway Lane when the girl of the dark enchanted him. And the flames of their candles flickered no longer, but each burned with the same strange, unconsuming pillar of white luminous air that had risen from Will's burning branch the other day. Paul's fingers no longer moved on his flute. He too stood motionless, holding it to his mouth, yet the music, very much like, but even sweeter than the music of the flute, went on. And so did Will, singing in spite of himself, finishing the verse, "By St. Agnes' fountain." And just as he began to wonder, through the strange white accompanying music that seemed to come from the air, quite how the next verse could be done unless a boy soprano were expected to sound like Good King Wenceslas as well as his page, a great, beautiful, deep voice rolled out through the room with the familiar words, a great, deep voice that Will had never heard employed in song before and yet at once recognized. "Bring me flesh and bring me wine, bring me pine logs hither, thou and I will see him dine, when we bear him thither." Will's head swam a little, and the room seemed to grow and then shrink again, but the music went on, and the pillars of light stood still above the candle flames, and as the next verse began, Merriman reached casually out and took his hand, and they walked forward, singing together. Page and monarch, forth they went together, through the rude wind's wild lament and the bitter weather. They walked down the long entrance hall, away from the motionless Stantons, past Miss Graythorne in her chair, and the cook, housekeeper, and maid, all unmoving, alive, and yet suspended out of life. Will felt as though he were walking into the air. Will felt as though he were walking in the air, not touching the ground at all, down the dark hall, no light ahead of them now, but only a glow from behind, into the dark. Sire, the night is darker now, and the wind blows stronger. Fails my heart, I know not how, I can go no longer. Will heard his voice shake, for the words were the right words for what was in his mind. Mark my footsteps, good my page, tread thou in them boldly, Merriman sang, and suddenly more was ahead of Will than the dark. There before him rose the great doors, the great carved doors that he had seen on the snow-mounted Chiltern hillside, and Merriman raised his left arm and pointed at them with his 5 fingers spread wide and straight. Slowly the doors opened, and the elusive silvery music of the old ones came, swelling up briefly to join the accompaniment of the carol, and then was lost again, and he walked forward with Merriman into the light, into a different time and a different Christmas, singing as if he could pour all the music in the world into these present notes, and singing so confidently that the school choirmaster, who was very strict about raised heads and well-moving jaws, would have fallen mute in astonished pride.